Hi everyone, welcome to our first lecture for TVR1. It's called Electronic Media Foundations. And if you haven't already, go back to the subunit A page and copy and paste the study guide for your quiz, pop it in a document or write those terms down on a piece of paper and take notes. You'll be able to use that for your quiz and you won't have to come back and try and find the answers in this video a second time. All right, so take careful notes and you won't need to do extra studying when quiz time comes. All right, let's get going. So our class is about all kinds of electronic media that are a part of our life. We'll go into those terms in a minute, but these are some of the topics that we're going to discuss throughout the semester. So we're going to talk about how electronic media evolved, its history. We don't go too deep into it like we're studying a history class, but we try and understand it. One, so that we are generally informed, especially if you're going to be working in this field, you need to know what came before. But also, I really like to teach that unit with an idea of how the history and evolution is relevant today. So the parts of it that we need to know because it informs how we interact with media right now. We'll also talk about media's role in our lives today. We'll look at some content from audio, video, and other sources and do some examination of that. We'll look at the media business and how it's regulated. We'll dive into some electronic media careers, including with one of your major projects. And finally, we'll look at some emerging trends, issues, and sort of the crazy future of media. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about Thor's hammer. Some of you may be very familiar with it, others may not. But in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the character Thor has a hammer and it's named, give me a break on this one, Mjolnir. I hope I got that right. And it belongs to Thor, of course, this guy. And there's some interesting facts that are important for us to know. It's a very powerful weapon. Only the worthy can lift or use it, and nobody else but Thor can seemingly lift it. So we need to know all of this information. This is foundational information about the hammer. And the reason it's important that the audience understands these rules and the guidelines with regard to this hammer are that it really helps set up an amazing moment that happens later in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In Avengers Endgame, there's an incredible scene where Cap can suddenly lift Thor's hammer. And the meaning of that and the excitement of that moment is amplified if you understand those foundational elements about the hammer, that it's so powerful and that worthy people can lift it. And that up until now, we didn't think anybody else could lift it. So we're learning in this moment that Cap is worthy and that he's going to wield this weapon. And in fact, he's going to help Thor at a really critical moment and all of Earth, apparently. So I just wanted to mention that because sometimes it can be a little dry when you get the foundational information in a class, but it is so important so that we understand everything and get those big moments throughout the development of our course. So that's what we're going to jump into. So here's some definitions. So let's start off with media. What do we mean by the term media? It's in the title of our course, right? It is the plural of medium, and it's from the Latin medius, meaning middle or between. And even though we have a medium here above me who's conjuring me in this video, apparently, it can mean other things as well. It, to us in this course, means anything that carries information between a source and a receiver. Our next term is mass media. And a mass media is a technology that's capable of duplicating or transmitting a message to many people over distances and sometimes time. So that makes sense, right? It communicates to a mass. The message itself is known as the mass communication part of it, and the technology is the medium. And the Gutenberg press, which was first constructed around 1440 and is pictured here, is sometimes considered the first piece of mass media technology. This is actually the first time we were able to put individual letters in that little tray there, organize them into words, and then put ink on it, put a piece of paper on it, and then press, and we could print many copies of the same text. Up until 1440, we couldn't do that. The only thing we had was monks' handwriting. books one at a time, or stories being told from person to person. Older forms of media, such as the printing press, but those that are non-electronic, and even some electronic media, are going to be called legacy media. And I'll tell you more about that term later. So electronic media is basically media that runs off of electricity. And even though electricity was first harnessed in the 1800s, it wasn't until 1925 that about half of American homes actually had electricity. And that allowed us to start creating technologies that people could have in their home to connect to mass media sources, and media could become electronic. So the first of these major tools was the telegraph, and most people didn't have one in their house, but there might have been one in their town. These were instruments connected by long cables, and electrical impulses sent signals via Morse code. Then broadcast radio and television came along. These were able to encode content into sound waves that were transmitted by large broadcast towers through the air and then interpreted by radios and televisions in our homes. And so they're called broadcast media. Some people even think that film in the 20th century can count as an electronic media, specifically because the projectors that are used to play it in nearly every theater run off of electricity, even though the film may be still shot and developed in a traditional way. But the term digital media has really taken over for electronic media, which is why it's interesting that the title of our course is Electronic Media and not Digital Media. We'll use them somewhat interchangeably, but let's talk about the nuances of them just a little bit. Digital media is content that is conveyed through the internet or some other digital means using binary code. You can see here all the zeros and ones. So it's very different than broadcasting it through the air. Although it can be transmitted through the air via Wi-Fi, it can be transmitted via satellite or via cable. But the digitizing of content into numbers is what really makes content digital media. So things like streaming television, music, games, and film are all digital media. Also social media, advertising, and ebooks, digital advertising, digital magazines and newspapers, and so much more. Digital media has really become a dominant means by which media is conveyed, and we send messages to mass audiences in today's world. It's probably a better term than saying electronic media for this course, but as I mentioned, we will use them interchangeably. All right. So let's talk about some of the core qualities of these different kinds of media that we're going to be exploring. First, I want to talk about legacy media. And by that, I mean things like the printing press, books, truly classic print media, but also broadcast media or DVDs that you might have bought, an album that you used to have. Those would all be considered different kinds of legacy media. So what are some of their qualities? They were intended for mass audiences. When you broadcast things out over the airwaves for anyone to collect, you have to make them appealing to a wide variety of people. There were limited amounts of most legacy media available due to cost and limited space, and so there was a finite amount of media. You might hear people talking about how in their day we only had 3 channels on television to choose from. It's linear, meaning we watch it from beginning to end. When I grew up and I played music, I didn't have the option to really skip ahead. I had a device that could take a cassette and play the music, and I could forward or go backward. But in general, it played beginning to end, all of it. And I didn't have the choice to break up and use interactivity and hyperlinks and things like that to move around. It's locked, meaning it's fixed and it doesn't change. You may have heard, for instance, that when Beyonce released her recent album, she actually made an edit to the digital streaming version of her album to make a correction after some feedback came in about her use of language. That doesn't happen with legacy media. Once it goes out, it's locked. You can't go back to everybody's house and say, may I have your DVD? I want to make a little change to my film. So the content is locked after it's published. It's one way. There's very little interactivity in legacy media, very little feedback loop. So you broadcast it, you send it out there, you deliver a newspaper to someone's house and they read it, and you don't really hear a lot back from the person who's consuming your media. It's also time delayed. We sometimes have to wait for content. So, for a book to be published and printed and sent, even for a newspaper to be printed and arrive at our house, it takes longer due to printing and distribution. And unless it's like a live sporting event on broadcast television, in most cases, it's usually time delayed in some way. It might even require extensive editing and so on. And finally, there's limited access. You need a specialized device. If you wanted to listen to radio over a broadcast channel, you had to have a radio that could interpret those waves into sound and have a speaker and play them. So you either have to have a subscription to things, sometimes you have to have a device. It's more limited in how many people can access. You previously had to pay up front for a lot of this content and or bring cabling and things like that to your home to access media. So it was more challenging to get access to a variety of different types of media. Digital media is a little bit different. So digital media can be highly personalized, right? So we get content that is delivered to us and designed for us based on our online habits, interest, customization, even algorithms. We can get niche content. Content can be created by a person in their home. We can consume it. Maybe we're one of 10 people who've used it, but we're really interested in that, wacky fishing video. It's unlimited. The amount of content available online is immeasurable and it continues to expand. It's nonlinear. Content can be filled with hyperlinks. It can be put into chunks that can be viewed in any order. The idea of a hyperlink is still relatively new. I first learned the word hyperlink in 1991 when I was in graduate school. There was a place called the Interactive Multimedia Group at Cornell University that was just starting to learn about this thing called the internet. And I took a class, and one of my first assignments was to create a hyperlink where I had to code it so that when you clicked on a word, it went to a different document. And so it was the very beginning of a document being able to go to another place or a website being able to click and open up another window, if you can believe it. The fluidity of the internet means it can be easily updated and edited, just like I mentioned with the Beyonce example. It's interactive, and this is really a big difference because we can like, share, comment, remix. We can do all kinds of things and give feedback instantaneously on content that we get. And that also means that the content can be more heavily shaped by us as consumers. The immediacy, being able to be available to consumers within seconds, is incredible. You can publish a book and people can be reading it less than a minute later. And you can post on social media, post articles. People can read those articles seconds after they've been written. And this is a big change because of digital media. And finally, the accessibility. Many people believe that it's more widely accessible, not just in terms of you can get it anywhere. You can be in the Kalahari Desert and listening to media, but you can also access it using a variety of tools to help you with visual descriptions, translation, and other tools if you need those, so more people can access more of the content. All right. We'll spend a lot of time in this course looking at the implications of this change that's happened in our society from legacy to digital media. But here's just a couple of observations. One, the switch has really altered the relationship between everyday citizens and the flow of information. So the immediacy of it, the amount of it, the accessibility of it, all of that has changed how we interact with information in our lives. The content can sacrifice quality for quantity. Having speed and large amounts of information may mean that we're seeing things that are not as well edited or composed or thought through or accurate as we have in the past. We also have to constantly question the credibility of information because it is possible over digital platforms for people to send out misinformation, disinformation, fabricated information, or true deepfakes. And we'll talk about all of those later. We have to think differently about consuming media than people before us did. Also, there's a sneaky third party that is watching almost all of our media engagement. And this is a term from media ethicist Jason Lanier. He says when we're on digital platforms, we often, through user agreements and other things that we either have or haven't given permission to, are being observed, maybe just digitally as far as our habits, but even the content of what we're saying or the things we're shopping for, the places we're traveling, our preferences as far as entertainment are all carefully collected and categorized and are being observed by a sneaky third party out there, companies, algorithms, who are utilizing that data and information in interesting ways. And that's a really new thing when we're consuming media. It used to just be us and the media. And finally, we're all becoming pawns in an epic battle to control the flow of information and thought patterns. This is a heavy thing to bring up the first week of class, I know. But I do want to point out that increasingly our attention span as consumers and viewers of media is a commodity that people want access to. They want our eyeballs. They can charge for our eyeballs being on their content to advertisers. They can make money from our attention. And so we're part of a battle that we may not even be aware of when we're consuming media, of someone who's fought for our attention. And when we pay attention to one particular TV show or start playing a certain game or watch a series of videos on YouTube, somebody has won that battle and somebody has lost that battle for our eyeballs. And we're going to talk about the implications of that later on. A really shocking visual that continues to blow my mind is this chart that I pulled off a real estate website, actually, that shows how we used to go out of the house often for different purposes in our life, and now we use digital resources for doing it. Some of this obviously goes beyond media, but when you think about how many things have moved onto digital platforms and we're using digital communication for now that we used to do real life face-to-face interaction for, it is quite overwhelming. Our second subunit in your module is all about this. It's exploring this document, a couple of other resources, and thinking about the digitalization of place. So you'll get into that. I like to end every lecture with a quote. Our final thought for the day is about the idea of disruption. When we switch from things like legacy media to digital media, when we digitize so many parts of our lives, this is disruption. It's a term that's used by marketers like Heather Simmons a lot as a positive thing in business, that you can create growth in new markets through disruption. But it also has societal implications. And she writes, those who disrupt their industries change consumer behavior, alter economics, and transform lives. So, how do they transform lives? Is it for the good of all? Is it for the good of us? Is it for the good of business? We'll talk about it. So I hope you really enjoy subunit B and you're enjoying our class so far.